Hello, everybody. This talk had a longer name on the the running order. I was writing this talk as we were shipping the game, so that's when I was pitching the talk originally. So I managed to edit it down a little bit for you. So welcome to Approachable Tactics and How to Adapt Complex Game Genres. I'm Joel. I'm a lead game designer at Ustwo Games. Ustwo Games has about, depending on when it is, 2 to 3 teams going at once, kind of like having different games on parallel development. And I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I'll start the talk by kind of telling you a bit about my history. I've been in the games industry for about 16 years now. And I started in the kind of Xbox 360 era, working on first-person and third-person shooters, including the infamous 50 Cent Blood in the Sand. Then started working on cartoony racing games, kind of karting games and stuff like Toy Box Turbos, and then found myself in 2016 kind of wanting to get out of that after having made 4 cartoony racing games in a row and kind of being like, I don't want this to be the rest of my life. It was really fun, but yeah, didn't want that to be the rest of my life. So I joined Ustwo Games when they were making Monument Valley 2 and then stayed there. That was as a senior designer, and then stayed there to help with or work on Assemble with Care, which I ended up being the maternity cover lead designer on. So that was my first lead design game. And then now we've just launched Desta a few months ago on console, on Steam and Switch, and then last year on mobile through Netflix Games. But that was the first game that I had the experience of being a lead game designer right from the very beginning, from prototyping all the way through to ship. So it's a new experience for me, and this talk is a bit of reflections on that. So yeah, I work at Ustwo Games. So through this talk, I'll talk about where did Desta, the game, come from, about deconstructing and reconstructing a genre, taking it from a notoriously complicated, inaccessible genre that is turn-based tactics into something that should be approachable to people who've never played that genre before. Example from a kind of problem that happened in production when we kind of realized some things to do with the game. And then finally finishing with some takeaway and hopefully some time for Q&A as well. So yeah, what is Desta, the memories between? I'll show you a little bit of a gameplay trailer.
I keep having the weirdest dreams about my hometown. I've not been back there in 2 years. Not since Dad's memorial. Now Mum's trying to sell the place. I can't find the words to reach her. Dad would know what to say. He used to have us throw this ball back and forth to work out our problems.
So you came back, Desta, after all this time?
You can't just show up and expect everything to be normal. I'm sorry. I should have kept in touch. I've imagined these conversations in my head 100 times. But I think I'm working my way through it.
Well, if it isn't Desta.
So hopefully that starts to give you a picture of what this game is. Oh,
I keep having the weirdest dreams of...
There we go. So Desta is a character-driven game. It's a game with a strong narrative, a strong protagonist. It's a turn-based tactics game. And through turn-based tactics, instead of kind of shooting people or hitting them with swords, as you might be used to in tactics games, it's a game about playing a dreamy game of dodgeball where you're throwing the dodgeball around in order to knock people out and win the game. And then it's also got roguelike elements. The kind of dream frame gives you this idea of you kind of get knocked out if you lose a match. The character wakes up, Desta wakes up in their bed, kind of realizing they've had this fever dream about their friends and their relationships, and goes back to sleep again and kind of starts that dream from the beginning again. But you're kind of repeating these kind of anxious thoughts over and over again, kind of trying to get through them better and better each time, both through kind of the narrative and through the tactics game. So to kind of give a different version of that, you kind of start at the beginning in a very comfortable street with very few opponents around you, picking up the dodgeball, kind of learning to throw it around, as you progress, you get new abilities. They give you new things you can do. So you've got grappling hooks and defensive abilities and things you can steal from other opponents. You kind of progress through, you build up the team, you see more enemies that have different abilities, different kind of things to take on. And then finally, you kind of reach that blockage. You lose a match, you get sent back to the beginning, and Desta wakes up in their bed, kind of starting the dream again, but with a lot of strength from the previous run before, kind of the knowledge, but also the power that you gained from the previous runs. Yeah, back at the beginning. So let's ourselves go back to the beginning. Where did Desta come from? Ustwo Games has had some mantras over the time. It's best known for Monument Valley. And one of the things, especially at the time during development, this was our kind of guiding light in terms of what our objective was as a company and as the things that we wanted to make. We wanted to bring what's meaningful about games to everyone. So we all know, I'm sure everyone in this room has had an amazing experience with a game, be that narrative or gameplay, and we all know those kind of wonderful moments they can create for us. But there's a load of barriers to entry to that, whether that's thematic or complexity or just not kind of looking like something a normal person would play. So this idea is about taking those amazing experiences and giving them to people who had maybe said, oh, games aren't for me. They don't look like they're for me. This game was made during lockdown, which I think had a big effect on it. It was our first lockdown game, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room kind of experienced that through different ways. It's quite traumatic, quite a lot of learning to be done. But yeah, I think it had an effect on the game and the game we wanted to make and led us to making Desta in particular. Some other things that are less situational, less about Ustwo Games and about us, was that we really wanted to make a game where the player learns about mastery. They look at a problem and they feel like they're solving it better than they were before. Monument Valley, Albert, some of the other games we've made, Assemble with Care, they're all games where if you know the answer to the puzzle, you can kind of breeze through it. You can kind of get through it, and it's the same as it was before. It's just whether you can remember how you did it before. But we were really excited about games. There was this Game Maker's Toolkit article, video about problem solving, Into the Breach, Hitman, games where you get given a problem in front of you rather than a puzzle, and it's up to you to work out how to solve it. And of course, the designers have put different ideas in there to how a player would solve it, but the player can really choose an approach and feel like it's their own approach, and they're solving this is how we kind of talked about it, is we're solving problems, not puzzles. And through that, the player would gain mastery. And that was the kind of game we wanted to make. We also kind of wanted to make a game about sport. We had a lot of brainstorming around different sports and how they adapt. This is from Mean Girls. Recommend that film if you haven't seen it. They're a really great place to let go of your anger, get some emotions out, like Gretchen Wiener is doing here. And kind of this kind of good, like especially this kind of idea of team sport was really kind of full of emotion, heightened kind of moments in your life, and kind of getting those out. This is very personal to me. Oh, I've got the same subtitle on that. I was reading this book, The Infinite Playground, that was about playground games and how they like aid cognitive development and socializing amongst kids. It's a really great book written by Holly Gramazio. But it was during lockdown when I couldn't see any of my friends in person. I was reading this book about playground games, and I really wanted to go and like test them out with people I knew. And of course, that was far beyond, that was very unsafe to do. And so that was kind of a big motivational point for me. And finally, the secret, the last one, was that there was an older prototype from a few years previously that a few of our colleagues had worked on, Fen, Max, and Florian. They had made this turn-based tactics dodgeball game that looked very different, as you can see from the game we shipped, but had something in it, and we knew we wanted to come back to it at some point and try again and see what we could make with it. So yeah, we had these three key things that excited us, that kind of drove us to making this concept, Desta, the memories between, a game with problems and mastery, a game about sport, and this older prototype. So now we'll get on to the kind of meat of the topic, which is the deconstructing and reconstructing. We'll start by assessing the genre, looking at tactics games. We kind of knew we wanted to make a tactics game and looked at that. How we went about prototyping and how that then informed creating the pillars. And then finally, taking that kind of prototyping early concept phase and how we developed it through production, through playtesting, and through reassessing those pillars and our aims and what the game was. So yeah, prototyping. The main thing that we did that I think is always the best way to approach a prototype is building one mechanic at a time, mostly because you always have ideas that are 10 steps ahead, but really trying to pull yourself back and make the prototype of the game one step at a time. So you're building one mechanic, you're looking at it, and you're seeing what needs to be added, and then you're adding the next. And we did this. This is literally the prototype for Desta and what it looked like with its earthbound sprites. First, we built moving on a grid. Then we added in this throwing this physics ball. Then we added in what we felt was the really core of the game. We wanted to make a game about a team. And so the next thing we added was this passing and throwing. And we ended up with a great flavor combination that you might not expect, which is this tactics grid, this turn-based game of grids, and then on top of it, a truly free physics ball that would bounce around the world and do things unexpected, but kind of react in a very physical way. I always used to compare it to this lemon curd and peanut butter, which is a great sandwich combination if you dare to try it. But yeah, that's it was somewhat of a topic at the office of these two things don't sound like they go together. Are they going to work together? And we kind of built a prototype just to prove that they would. So yeah, we ended up with, after a couple of weeks, a basic prototype that really showed off the core mechanics and trying not to overcomplicate it, trying to add just a bit of HP, a bit of a bit of movement, a very basic AI system, just to try and find that thing of that kind of 30 seconds of fun that we knew that we could then elaborate on, add to over time, and build the rest of the game on top of. And it really didn't end up, didn't end up looking that different. Under the hood, it really isn't that different to the game we ended up making. We ended up with an 8x8 grid, with most of our matches being 3x3, a team of 3 versus a team of 3, with around 3 hit points each. This is the kind of, we found this in the prototype, we kind of tried to build from the bottom up, and this is really the game that we ended up with. So yeah, hopefully this kind of, I'm talking very specifically about turn-based tactics here, but I kind of want these to kind of, this is a process that I think went quite well and something I want to kind of take forward with me, and I think is useful, hopefully, for other people in the room about how you would go about taking stuff from big, complicated genres and how you would kind of boil them down to something more approachable to the player base you want to reach. So yeah, assessing the genre. First of all, what's great about it? Thematically, turn-based tactics games are interesting because you're using a group of characters together. You're doing smaller matches and skirmishes that have clear objectives, and you're using that to make up a larger campaign. Again, this is just what we were finding interesting about it. There are lots of other great things about the genre, but this is the kind of things that we found the most exciting about it. Abstractly, they're a game with mastery. There's the thing we were excited about at the beginning, with problems rather than puzzles. And as well, there's planning in your head. You can look at a game board for a game that you understand, whether that's chess or checkers or Fire Emblem Heroes here. It's a big fan, we have big fans of in the team. And you can kind of understand what's going on and be like, ooh, this is the move I might make in this situation. And half the turns happen in your head before they happen in the game action. And again, that kind of mastery, allows players to have different play styles to play through. They'll kind of find the things that they like in the game and then be able to action it and make a team around it. And that was something that was really exciting to us. And then finally, mechanically, grid-based movement, line of sight, the idea that there's special abilities, that each character would have something iconic to them. They would have a role and a special ability that only they could do. And then, quite boringly, turns and action points. They're very easy to understand. They're very board gamey. People understand what those are, but they're very fruitful for making interesting decisions as a player. So, what's getting in the way? Even a game like Mario and Rabbids, which is a very appealing game, a game I really like, it has numbers like this, 56. Luigi's got 185 hit points there, and the XCOM characters on the side, they all have their primary weapon, they have their equipment, they have whatever talent trees you've given them. If you're someone who's new to tactics, these things, you don't have a grounding, you don't have a good foundation beneath your feet in this genre. These things are very overwhelming and overly granular. What's the difference between the fact that Rabbid Peach is getting 80 hit points and Mario's and Luigi's getting 56? There's not much difference to you. Again, that there's information overload, that there's things hidden in sub-menus, and that the map is so big and there's so many units that you can't look at a screenshot and understand what's going on in the game. Like this, we felt was like a really key point that was getting in the way of people getting into tactics genre that they that maybe they would be interested in if this wasn't in the way. And also violent themes, like this was just me popping on Steam a week or so ago about what the highest, like the hottest tactics games are, and they all have pretty violent themes. I mean, Persona shares some DNA with our game a little bit. We've definitely Persona fans in the team with the kind of dreamlike elements and stuff, but it's still kind of hitting each other with swords and blowing people up. And that's probably the least violent one on the list there, along with kind of things you'd maybe more associate with tactics like Warhammer and like period war games. Of course, there are lots of games out there that have done these things before, that have solved these problems before, and we aren't the first people to solve these problems, but I will talk more on that a bit later. So, taking this research, we started to create what our pillars of the game would be. And we created this pitch, that the game would be about a diverse cast of characters and personalities, that it would be a long-form game that you would play over multiple sessions, rather than the usual us two fare of it's 2 hours and then it's done and you put it away. That we're still leaving players with an emotional message, and that the game has a style, a visual style, and a depth that's approachable to casual people, but it's also interesting to experienced players. So these were the product pillars, but what were the design pillars? We kind of felt the need to go one level deeper and kind of find out what, for the design choices we were making, what was leading the way. And how we did that was we looked to our player personas, and these we were building during the kind of prototyping and kind of pitching stage. And we had 4 of them. We had our first-time tactics player, who I've been talking about a lot, the person who's never played, they've played games before, but they've never played strategic ones. We've got our one run player, which is normally me when I play a game, which is, I like strategic games, but I don't have time to play something that's going to take like 30, 40 hours. I want to see a game through. I want to see what it's got for me. And when the story's done, I'm probably going to put it down. And then at the bottom, you've got kind of 2 different versions of a highly engaged player. You've got the player who's really interested in finding out about team building. And you've also got the player who's really interested in collecting and seeing everything that the game has to give you. And out of all these people, as you can tell from me talking, our most important player for us is the first-time tactics player. That was the person we were interested in capturing and looking after, and hopefully evolving into one of the other people, like finding what they really like about tactics and showing them that the genre was there for them and that they would be really excited about it. Maybe they would get really into the team building element. Maybe they would get really into just the story and seeing what tactics have to show, or maybe they'd kind of become a completionist player and try and see everything that the game has to offer. But yeah, taking players through on that journey was really important to us. So with all this kind of information is kind of the research base that we built our design pillars from. And the first one of that was easy to understand numbers. You can see here with Pikmin, there are big number 5s on stuff. With checkers, you can see all the units on the board. These are games that have done it before, and something we really wanted to have as a core part of our design ethos. That easy to understand numbers, reduce the cognitive load on people, and allow you to understand the board state easily with a glance. That will be number of units, that will be HP, that will be number of balls, that will be how much customization you could put on the character. It does also limit power growth, so that was kind of a downside that I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. But it does mean that each action has high meaning. When someone only has 2 HP like this, and that only goes up to 5 HP, each ball throw becomes really important. And therefore, each player's action has more weight behind it. Readable game states, that you can look at the board and understand what's going on. This means that that thing that we were hoping for early on in our research could stay true, that the game happens as much in your head as it happens when you take an action in front of you. But also that it's mobile session friendly. Our game was first launched on mobile through Netflix games, and the idea that you're playing on mobile means that you can turn it off at any time. You might get a call, you might get a notification, you might be finishing your time on the bus, and you put it in your pocket, and when you pick it out again, you look at the board state, it needs to be really clear what the problem was you were trying to solve previously, and that you can jump back into it without having to have a huge recap. And again, yeah, everything is on the table in front of you. Finally, playful feel was really important to us. Like, tactics games can sometimes feel a bit dry to interact with. They're very menus driven, but there are great games out there that don't have that kind of dryness to those interactions. And to us, things like Angry Birds, which is a great use case for mobile, but also, I can't remember the name of this game, but it's like a dungeon crawling game where you're like flicking little discs at each other. You're kind of defeating wizards and ogres and stuff, but you're all doing it through playing that kind of table football game that you play when you're a kid with pennies on the table. And it kind of takes something that it takes the action out of menus and into something tactile that the player can do on the screen and on the controller when we kind of went to move it onto controllers. So yeah, making this most frequent verb something physical became part of that core pillar. Making it so that you're dragging and aiming the ball so that you're able to intuit where it's going to go around the board, but also that other abilities that the player has, like grappling hook, like lasso here, also use that. So you're using that interaction as frequently as possible. It also allows you to have even less hidden information, and that you can master it over time. You can get better at throwing the ball. You can get better at using lasso. And finally, this kind of idea of it, this was kind of a later thing that we kind of came up with, this idea of it being fun, physical, and fair in how the ball moves around, that it should be predictable to an extent, but sometimes surprise you, but it should always feel fair and physical. It's not just doing random things. So those top 3 were the 3 pillars that we had in a document that we kept referring back to throughout development as new people joined the team. But this final one, which came from the pitch, we never actually wrote down in the design pillars, but was really important to us. This kind of introduction to the fun of tactics. It was missing from the documentation, but it was something we constantly talked about. And kind of going back and looking at all those kind of older documents, it kind of made me realize, wait a minute, there's a really huge omission from all these documents that we did actually use as a guiding light. So I'm going to go through an example of something we built within the game, like zoom in on something and kind of talk about how the pillars helped us come up with that. we were coming up with enemy types. This is literally a screenshot from our Miro board with some pictures for enemy types. 3 of these ended up being in the final game, but they didn't look like they do here. But they're always built from this idea of what are they encouraging the player to do? What part of the game are they encouraging? It's very kind of classic enemy design mantra of like, oh, like this enemy should make you feel like this. This is the angry bull comes at you and makes you want to keep your distance. The shield bearer makes you want to like aim better. And the big shot is the kind of big bruiser character who does one big throw that is really scary to you. And we prototyped these in Miro, which is one of the many kind of online collaborative whiteboarding tools you can use, where you can all kind of edit it together, and was a massive design tool for us. But because we built with this idea of everything being very visible to the player, everything being low numbers, it meant we could actually prototype the game and the enemy behaviors we wanted on paper in that kind of ideal version of it. It was the first project where we really went in depth on paper prototyping because we could, because it's a turn-based tactics game and you could just play out and get a feel for what are AI behaviors you want? What are things that we want to be able to do with these enemies, and do they actually encourage the behavior that we hope they do? But yeah, so these enemies should encourage particular behaviors. They should create different effects in different combinations, and they should visually convey their behavior to the player through what they look like. We had a bunch of scary looking people as part of Desta's dream, people who induce anxiety in Desta in various ways. Yeah, we did a really good job of, the art team did an amazing job of kind of creating this little diverse group of characters who don't look like particularly named characters, but are those kind of grunt-like enemies. So the big shot ended up being our kind of first enemy type that we built. And he really teaches target prioritization and ball starvation. This latter one was a kind of tactic we found by playing the game a lot. But this idea of here's a character who can only do a hit once he's picked up a ball in the previous turn, he'll throw it at you the next turn and do double damage. And so you really have to get out of his way. You really have to worry about him. You either have to kind of focus him down or get into cover. And that you can kind of stop that in its tracks early on by picking up the balls, by not allowing him to have the ammunition he needs and have ball starvation. So really early on, we're teaching some good tactics to the player. So developing, playtesting, and assessing. This is the kind of part of the talk which feels like this to me. It's the, oh cool, we've worked out what the game is, let's just build the game. This is a kind of visual diary which I thought was a bit fun to show of how the game looked over the kind of the 3 years that we were developing it, right through from those very early Earthboundy looking game to this kind of more kind of slightly surreal dreamscape of Desta's memories at the bottom. And I'll kind of jump into one example, again, zooming in to kind of see how these pillars and this kind of research that we did at the beginning really informed some of the solutions we came up with. We had something called the Christmas test, which was about 9 months before ship. That was our big user test. It was the first time we had kind of meta progression in the game. We had our first stab at the roguelike, and we had a big kind of closed invite-only, like friends and family kind of test with a bunch of people to be able to get what they felt, not just about the match, but about the game as a whole. And at this point in the game, you can see what I'm going to highlight is the problem that we had a little bit. The loadout and the progression was quite simplistic. Desta would get more tools, more abilities to use through challenges, which were kind of goals that the player could meet, like do a rebound shot 20 times, and then you get a special ability that was tied to rebounds. And then teammates would increase in power by leveling them up through XP that we kind of called trust, that would kind of open up your connection with them. But there aren't very many customization options here. Desta stays with the same amount of HP and movement that they had at the very beginning, and so do their teammates. What's the time? So yeah, this was the big feedback that we got from players at this Christmas test, that There was no progression of strength for Desta, and they didn't like that. They wanted Desta to get stronger on repeated runs. That failed runs didn't feel like you were progressing at all. It felt like you were resetting. And that gameplay and meta systems didn't link well with narrative. So we kind of had this problem and this tension between our pillars that we built for ourselves or our assumptions around them and the feedback we were getting from players in the game we built. That keeping complexity low through no power scaling and allowing for tactical choices was fighting against our target audience who expected that power to grow, expected to be able to put in some time into the game and to get better at the game, not just through their own kind of puzzle solving, but through their actual characters leveling up somewhat. So we kind of had to go back to basics a bit. And if you've been to some of the other design talks today, this is kind of feels like it's a running theme through the day. This idea of going back and reassessing your original plan and your original objectives. So no progression strength for Desta. Why is that? Let's look at our pillars and work out why we ended up there. It was easy to understand numbers. It was playful feel. And it was this readable game state. And it really was this easy to understand numbers. But easy to understand numbers doesn't mean that numbers can never grow. That's kind of just an assumption that we built in our own heads based on the prototype we built at the very beginning. And we kind of got like stuck in our brains. So how do we solve this problem? Again, it's through the element of the pillars. That these things might seem obvious, but yeah, that there is a unified character XP system, that you can't see the numbers, you see bars going up. So we're not overwhelming the players with numbers, but they are seeing progression happen. They're seeing power grow over time with a very simple XP system. And that these XP jumps are one-off granular, like, this sounds weird, big grains, big chunks. So when you level up HP, it's a growth from a 3 to a 4, which is much more meaningful than 11 HP going up on your Pokemon when you level it up, and trying to stay in that low numbers, but still allow that power growth. And finally, this was also our opportunity to we felt like we didn't have enough complexity in the tactics, that players weren't getting the tactics they wanted. And it was a really good thing to add in to give you as an extra reward for the progression. So like, as you're leveling up, you were getting these secondary abilities that we kind of built into the game at this point, which were these passive abilities. That meant that we didn't have to add on extra UI. We didn't have to add on extra actions for the player to initiate, but they were there in the background and allowed players to have more tactical skill, or more tactical options as they got more used to the game and the game's complexity. So yeah, this like really important point for me is that you have to play test and you have to look to your target players for when you run into these when you run into these problems, and you have to look to your pillars as well for the solutions, because the information's out there. It's sometimes you need to look at it from a different angle, but they really do help design pillars. Cool. I'm gonna wrap up a little bit. So this was our kind of process. We assessed the genre. We looked at what was the most exciting things about it that we really wanted to make sure we preserved, and also what we thought was getting in the way. What was the fluff that we could cut through? That the prototype was built one step at a time instead of a grand design from the beginning that we would then kind of try and execute over a long period of time. And that research, that prototyping created pillars that informed everything that came afterwards. And that process of developing, playtesting, and reassessing became really important. So yeah, kind of reaching the end now. And these are the kind of key takeaways from me. This is a kind of, was a really useful exercise for me to look back at this game that we developed over 3 years. Made me realize some of the things that I'd kind of done unconsciously as a team. But yeah, distilling complex genres to be approachable and accessible can create interesting and innovative new solutions that you don't expect. That you should really boil down your designs before you build them up, and that you should regularly reassess your assumptions by looking to your target players and your pillars. Cool. Thank you very much. Cool. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks for that. It was a really good talk. I must confess, I'd never heard of the game before. Definitely going to play it after this. Looked really cool. One of the things you said was interesting, though. Like, you designed this for sort of almost like baby's first tactics games, like really simple progression route for it. And then the playtesting sort of brought up that you needed that sense of progression. You gave him more health, you gave him more abilities. What did you do in terms of balancing that after the fact to sort of make sure that the game didn't become too easy and it was keeping players' interests?
A lot of spreadsheets to begin with, classic, but also playtesting with people a lot. Like, just, I think that's a real core Ustwo games about making sure you're playtesting. I think when you're balancing, you're always going to be trying to balance around one type of player, and you have to try and look to who's the king out of all those different types. And kind of, as that slide showed in the beginning, we kind of knew that first-time player was the person we really wanted to, which ended up with us creating a kind of hard mode that unlocks when you finish the game for those people who have breezed through the game because they're an experienced tactics player who like the story and like the tone. We kind of built, as a kind of post-launch content, this kind of hard mode to give people what they wanted when they were really engaged. So yeah, kind of picking a target player who was, in our case, that first-time player, and building the balancing around that, but kind of making sure there were things like, we also had some kind of one-off challenges where you could have a particular, it's almost like a chess puzzle. There's like 20 of those that you can play through once you finish the game as well. So yeah, hope that answers your question. Cool. Okay.
Hi. How did you measure the mastery of players? Like you say in the playtest, how did you know that, okay, these players are really getting the mastery effect? Like, are they using abilities or?
Yeah, I think a combination of analytics and surveys, which are very old school tools, but like trying to look at, one of the things we felt we did a good job of the balancing is when we got loads of surveys back and they said, oh, this ability is overpowered, but they were talking about various different abilities. Someone would be like, oh, this ability is the most overpowered ability. And someone else would say in a survey like, oh no, your game's really unbalanced. This ability is the most. And it's like a little bit of an echo of, like, I don't know, forum arguments about like which character is the most overpowered. And that gave us a bit of hope. But also just looking at the analytics of like, when you start, just kind of, this is very dry, but starting a match with an ability, what's your win-loss ratio as a player, and being able to look at all the abilities and go, okay, they're all within this margin. And this one's, we actually really had to nerf one ability before launch, as you kind of, as you do when you kind of look at data and it tells you something. But yeah, kind of the combination of classic kind of analytics and survey, and trusting your players to tell you kind of like, I think we just asked them things like, what was your favorite ability? And making sure that was wide enough and there wasn't just one answer that was 90%. Yeah. Cool. This lady over here. Sorry.
Hi, you mentioned the difference between a problem and a puzzle. Is that essentially that a problem, there's more than one way to solve it? Or is it more than that?
I think it's a bit more than that, but it's, there's a great video by Game Maker's Toolkit on YouTube about it, which I think would do a better job of explaining it than me. But I think a problem can also evolve like a tactics game does. It's you look at it and you know that taking an action will have a reaction from it, and you're kind of playing off that. So you're not just trying to solve, but you're trying to kind of maybe stem off possible futures as well. And yeah, I think that's kind of the thing for me, is that the idea of you're not just finding the right key for it, but you're trying to predict it as well. This person, yeah.
Hi, so you mentioned that at some point your testers found that there was a discrepancy between the narrative and the mechanics, that they didn't fit together. How did you go about fixing that?
We tried a few things, and I think that's one of the things that we didn't find a perfect solution for. We had this visual novel style that you can kind of see in the trailer, where you've got kind of talking heads before, and I'm trying to think, the we were having this kind of moment where you would start a level, you would have the conversation with the opponent, and then you would have the match, and then the narrative would happen before and after, but not during it. And we kind of tried a multi-prong approach to this. I think we made it a lot better, but we didn't fully solve it. And we did this through things like speech bubbles in the match, where characters are kind of shouting off about things. They're talking about it. They're not just like lifeless entities when you're playing the match. And also that as you play and repeat over time, so you kind of come up against kind of the first chapter boss, who's your best friend, who you've been ghosting because you feel anxious about the fact you haven't texted them, that kind of problem. And each time you get back there, Desta is a bit more confident in themselves about the reason. And once you've defeated them a couple of times, Desta's like, oh yeah, I know this. I know how to solve this, and kind of becomes more used to the situation. And those were the ways in which we did it. We kind of had this evolving narrative based on how many times you'd won the match to them before, and also this kind of quick system. There were a couple of other smaller ways, but those were the two big ways that we tried to address it. Cool. Person over here in a hat. Oh, sorry.
Hi, sorry to ask yet another question that touches on balance.
No, that's all right.
But I thought what you said was really interesting about having big grains of small numbers of hit points, right?
Yeah.
Things like that. You covered how you address balance, which is cool. I was interested, did you find it difficult to avoid big difficulty spikes in the progression of the game? If, say, a character has 3 hit points, we can give them a 4th hit point, but that's like a big jump, right?
Yeah.
So, did you have like a process for working through that?
Yeah, and I think one of the other struggles we had in relation to that was the fact that we had an XP system, which in a game where you could be a low-level player and be repeating back down here, and we don't know how long you've been doing that down there, and so you're kind of, there were some problems there, and we did that. Very dry answer, very specific answer, but we did that through kind of an exponential curve of XP. It didn't scare us that our numbers were getting stupidly big, because players couldn't actually see the numbers on the XP bars. We hid that information, but all you saw is a slow moving bar that moved a little bit when you were doing your low levels. And then when you got to the end of it, you were kind of, if you took a low level character right to our final chapter, you can do it. You do it in debug all the time when you're kind of making the game, you're kind of leveling up multiple times and churning through it, but kind of the classic kind of exponential curve, to try and make sure that once players get to a chapter, they're still making meaningful levels up. And I've realized I haven't really answered your question.
That's okay.
I think what we did is, because we had these big grains and we were spreading them out so far, we had lots of like fun toys to feed the player in between those moments. So we could really make sure we had a really good idea of what HP and movement range, which were the 2 stats that you level up over the game, people had, because they were so like widely spaced. And what we gave them in between was fun toys, like that offered more breadth, but maybe not more power.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Cool. There's a person in the hat over there. It's been waiting a while. Sorry.
Okay. Hey, Joel. Thank you.
Hello.
So Desta is a rogue-like. It has like kind of rogue-like elements to it.
Yeah. Very light-like.
Light-like. And you mentioned that there was some of the players that you kind of tested with had a problem with progression, or kind of not seeing player progression.
Mm-hmm.
At what point did you decide this is going to have these rogue-like elements? And do you think that contributed to that kind of maybe not feeling that sense of progression? Because like when you start again, you start again.
Yeah.
And did you consider making a more kind of linear kind of thing down the route of Monument Valley, that type of thing?
That was the other thing this talk could have been about. Or it was the talk that kind of stripped, like it's probably you sensing it a little bit coming in at the sides there. Like one of the big things we didn't do in making it a roguelike is properly do this process for the roguelike side of it. We onboarded ourselves to one genre, but we don't onboard you to another. And we didn't think about the interplay between those two things as deeply as we should have until we kind of got well into production, when we kind of had that realization. We did consider thinking about it as a more linear game, but we really wanted to make that like stab at making this kind of repeatable game, and we felt like tactics and this kind of like giving you different tools to solve the same problems and mixing up the problems every time you play through them. It was something we really wanted to try out and something we were really interested in doing. And I don't think we've got a perfect execution of it, but I think we learned a lot of things through it.
Thank you.
Cool. Person in the front.
You've talked before about how it's a game, or how you were making a game with a relatively specific target audience. You've talked about playtesting before as well. How often did you prioritize in playtests playing with those, like that specific, precise audience?
Yeah, so a lot of we used like third-party providers who, most of them, I think, we used Game Tester and Playtest Cloud. You can ask them specifically for players who fit a certain demographic or fit or self-profess to be like softcore or hardcore gamers or those kind of things. And yeah, we kind of use that because a lot of the people you get when you use friends and family are people who are already highly engaged. But I think we also used our friends and family who are less like self-selecting in that and trying to put it in their hands and see how they play and see how they react. But yeah, that kind of combination of trying to seek out the people we knew, people we knew who kind of fit into that gap. And we actually had a couple of people in the studio who were really not well-versed in kind of deep strategy games and stuff. We had some people who were and some people who weren't. And we made sure to go back to them and ask them their opinion regularly and kind of check-in meetings. And yeah, also using user testing that allowed us to be like, hey, can we have some people who profess? And I mean, they're on a play testing service. So to a certain degree, they're already slightly above the norm. So you have to kind of take that into account when you look at their feedback and surveys. But a lot of them, you do get to just look at videos of them literally playing the game and see their reactions and hear their reactions. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Oh, are we at time or?
We are at time.
Cool.
Maybe one more.
Yeah, someone over there with their hand up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned sort of at the beginning that you chose this sort of 8x8 grid. So I was wondering how that sort of impacted your design choice going forward. So you mentioned like the enemy that you was talking about, you know, sort of either get out the way and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But with such a small grid, at least compared to things like XCOM, things like that.
Yeah.
How did that pose any challenges when trying to do like setting up levels and like putting terrain in certain places and where sort of characters start and where they can go? Because you're obviously you have a lot less space to work with.
Yeah. First thing we did was the steal from the best, which is the Into the Breach uses an 8x8 grid. And we thought, well, if Into the Breach can do it, so could we, which is a bit of a big-headed thing to say. But I mean, I think it's like, well, you can, Into the Breach is, for me, one of my favorite tactics games ever. And you can do amazing, interesting like tactics things in that game with 8x8. So that gave us the confidence. But obviously each game is different, especially with our throwing. We did find it a little bit limiting at first to kind of work out how intricate these spaces should be, especially when we took them from the Miro board, which looks top down, to that kind of isometric angle that we had in game. And we realized that we were obscuring a bunch of things, and we designed maps that were a bit too intricate and we needed to kind of thin them out a bit. But we did a lot of that in early prototyping, and we did a lot of that to kind of make sure that everything was visible on screen at once. And we made some prototype maps that felt really different to one another and showed us that breadth that really allowed us to think, okay, if we can get from this complexity to this complexity with just a couple of weeks of prototyping, then I'm sure we had the confidence to kind of know that we could fill in the gaps between those things.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. Cool. Thank you very much for coming. Hope you have a rest of your good develop.